Metroid Fusion is one of those games that I think can be kind of hard to get your head around. It was pretty well received at the time of its release, which was a full 8 years after Super Metroid, the last entry in the series, released 2 console generations prior. But in a lot of ways, it's kind of an anomaly in the Metroid family. It was the first Metroid game I ever actually beat. I had struggled to get into Super Metroid the first couple times I tried it, which sucked, because sometimes you pick up a game and you just know it's good, like you know that there's something special about it, but you just can't seem to get into the fun that everyone else seems to be having. Then I played Fusion and suddenly was like, oh, this game is actually teaching me how to play Metroid games. That's really cool. And so I had a good time with it. And then eventually I was able to go back and beat Super Metroid and finally have fun with it. And then I pre-ordered Dread when it came out and beat it within a week. It's too late. I'm a Metroid fan now. But even after playing through those titles, Fusion remains my favorite by far. And I want to talk about why. Before I begin, there's a fundamental complaint that a lot of diehard Metroid fans have about Fusion, and I think it's a very valid one, which is that the game forces you to follow an extremely linear progression. In older titles, but Super Metroid especially, the game had a linear structure, but would subtly encourage you in repeat playthroughs to sequence break, using advanced techniques that essentially made it more of an open world game than a strictly linear one, which is a really cool level of depth that you don't see in a lot of games. Super Metroid promises that if you give yourself enough time with the game, if you challenge yourself to pick apart its systems and rules, you will eventually have a play experience fundamentally different from your first time through. That's how I ended up learning to be able to play Super in the first place. Once I learned what the game was asking me to do, and I got enough experience in the series to understand its structure and systems, I could trust the game to unfold in a way that would engage me. And Fusion just doesn't have that depth. The best proof of this, I think, is the way that professional speedrunners approach each game. In Super, the vast number of movement strats and glitches open up multiple routes to optimize beating the game, and every new exploit has the potential to radically change the best route. In Fusion, the best known way to beat the game quickly is to corrupt the memory. That's it. You cannot push back against the structure of Metroid Fusion. The only way to break through it is to completely break it. I'd like to argue that this structure is actually what holds Metroid Fusion together as a whole, that this linearity, rather than being a detriment to the game, is actually necessary for the experience it's trying to create, by limiting your agency and pushing you to win it back against a steadily encroaching foe. A lot of really great video essays have talked about Fusion as fundamentally a horror game in that way, the only true horror game in a franchise that admittedly keeps dipping its toes into the horror pool, and I agree, and I think that's why the linear structure of Metroid Fusion is actually one of its greatest strengths. Jenna Stieber from Polygon makes a damn good soup of an argument when talking about how Fusion is more of a fear-based experience than Dread, and while I did feel a lot of tension and anxiety when going through the Emmy zones in Dread, more often than not the feeling I felt in that game was stress, rather than fear, or, dread. Dread's Emmy zones are these unavoidable set locations with clear landmarks and entrances and exits, so you know that you're going to have to go through them, and once you defeat the Emmy, you know that its zone will no longer be hostile. When going in, it requires less trepidation as much as it requires just cautiousness and careful planning. You know that something's going to go awry when you enter one of these zones, and then it happens, and then you die, and then you do it again until you find a way through. In a lot of ways, the more open-ended structure of Dread, which feels a bit more like a sequel to Super than it does to Fusion, ends up relieving some of the tension by giving the player options. Metroid Fusion deprives the player of options, and that's the point. I've said quite a lot of words here about Fusion without actually talking about the gameplay, but I think it's important to start with the context of where Fusion sits in the franchise and how it feels to play compared to the other games, because the experience of playing Fusion is fundamentally different to the experience of playing the other games in the franchise. For some people, that's a very valid reason to dislike the game. It makes it feel significantly different to play compared to the more open-ended Super Metroid. But for me, that more linear experience is what makes Fusion special. So with that out of the way, I want to finally talk about Fusion's central premise and the relationship it creates between player and game, and why that has resonated with me so much. Metroid Fusion is a game about agency and powerlessness and trauma and anger and fear. You play as Samus, who in previous and later titles is this unstoppable, almost mechanical force to be reckoned with, feared across the stars as the galaxy's greatest bounty hunter. Yet this time around, you are weakened by disease and unable to face your greatest opponent yet. In this game, Samus is infected by the X-Parasite, an alien life form that the Metroids were created to eliminate due to the fact that the X-Parasites can copy and extract any form of life they infect. And after barely surviving due to a vaccine made from the cells of the last surviving Metroid before you wiped them out in a previous game, you end up in a cramped space station as the only person able to exterminate the growing X threat. You are clawing your way back to a fraction of the health and power you had in the previous game, and you are always at the mercy of your environment. It's not just that enemies hit harder than they did in the previous games, it's also that you physically cannot wear the same armor to protect yourself. Your fleshy human skin doesn't do well in lava, and the Metroid cells in your body decay under cold as well. Instead of stealing back abilities from space pirates, you're torrenting them from a corrupt government and its lifeless computer AI, and far more slowly than you need them. The Metroid series is famous for taking a lot of inspiration from the Alien franchise, but I think that Fusion is the most sincere in its homage to Alien, as it traps you on board a space station slowly populating with deadly aliens, all while an uncaring and conspiratorial bureaucracy watches and waits. Your goal, as presented to you by the Federation, is to figure out what's going on at the BSL station, a research lab suspended in an asteroid designed to study the flora and fauna of the nearby Metroid homeworld, SR-388. You would be forgiven for having questions about why the floating lab isn't just on the planet, why it instead chooses to perfectly recreate SR-388's environment and then create other environments entirely hostile to the native species living there, but you put those questions away for now. You're Samus. You got infected by the X-Parasite on the planet itself, so not having to go back there while still in recovery from the attack is probably a welcome relief. And yet there was an explosion on the station, and then communications went dark. Something feels wrong. This is the first game where we really hear Samus's thoughts, and she feels this too. She's aware of it, and something awakens a nameless fear in her heart. So you explore the station, at first utterly alone, and what do you find? The X-Parasite is here too. As a video game player, even if you hadn't seen any of the original marketing of the game in the early 2000s, you probably could have guessed that the X-Parasite would be rearing its ugly nodules once you got on board. And so after a boss battle and the regaining of the Yoga Ball, you interface with the station's onboard AI, which you nickname Adam as an homage to your last and only human commanding officer. For the rest of the game, you find yourself repeatedly directed around the station to solve local problems, try to prevent the X from spreading, and work to recover your strength over time. Then this happens. That's you! That's Samus! That's the Samus from Super Metroid! Apparently, when the Federation shipped your old armor on board the station to study how the X infested it, the X fit itself into the armor shape and shaped the armor into a nightmarish copy of Samus, which Adam dubs the SAX. And now for the rest of the game, you are being hunted the way you hunted the Metroids. You have at your disposal a different way of moving around the station. Yes, as a consequence of not having to wear the heavy armor, but also probably as a consequence of the Game Boy screen being tighter than the SNES screen. Samus has a quicker jump and runs automatically. You can no longer infinite wall jump or bomb jump, locking you into the sequence of the game. You can pull yourself up by ledges, a feature so great that Zero Mission made it a power-up and Dread just made into a feature. You no longer have to shuffle through your abilities, super missiles are missiles now. The whole thing makes Samus feel faster, more nimble, and more desperate, given the fact that enemies can now knock you out in a few hits. I personally love the fact that the enemies in Dread do this as well. Metroid Fusion is a hard game. It's not as combat driven as Dread, but it is conflict driven, and you will consistently find yourself dying to these stupid spiky caterpillars because they just drain the life juice out of you like it's nothing. These bionicle dragonflies and hornets and rainbow larvae knock the hell out of you whenever you bump into them. This game has a ton of save spots, except when it decides not to, because it knows it's going to kick your ass, and I love it. In Making Deep Games, which is a book I can't recommend enough, Doris C. Ruch talks about how games are first and foremost simulations of experiences of reality. Games will always fail as one-to-one emulations of reality, but they can be exceptionally good at emulating experiential systems of reality. You can't perfectly recreate a human city within a game, for example, but you can recreate some of the systems of a human city within a game, and in doing so can emulate a particular experience of that reality. The way Ruch describes being able to model an experience is by creating rules, rewards, and conflict for both positive and negative incentives. By using these core game elements, you can actually make a player feel something. You can't control the experience they will have for the same reason no one can, but you can model a system for them with rules and incentives, and you can make that system punishing or gentle, and so people will react to the system as they would to punishing or gentle reality. Metroid Fusion is a punishing system, and the quote-unquote fun of the game is about growing to overcome the trauma of your circumstances, because ultimately this game knocks you down to your knees at the very start, but promises to give you everything you'll need in order to be able to get back up. Video Game Donkey illustrates this point very well in his Samus Returns video when he says that the fun of these games is when they make you feel like you're outsmarting the game design, even though it's all very deliberate. Metroid Fusion gives me the same feelings of tension and release as watching the movie Alien, a movie that starts slow, builds in grotesque panic and danger, and then ends in catharsis when Ripley's actions prove to be good enough to escape. Yes, she got lucky, but her actions were also sufficient to get her out of there. That's what this game's about. Sometimes you get really lucky running from the SAX, but the only reason you survive is because you keep getting stronger yourself. I love how Adam keeps telling you over and over again that you're only at 10% of your strength, 20% of your strength, and that the singular way to survive is to run. I love the structure of the refresh rooms too. They're almost always right next to the navigation rooms where you sync up with Adam, and so it often feels like the Federation is rationing you your health back, conditional on you accepting their next order. The only time you actually combat the SAX head-on is at the end of the game, and it still knocks the wind out of you. The game surprises you with these little moments of sheer terror, where the SAX is just there, and you either have to stay put or run, and the game does not tell you what to do. The sound design and music of Metroid Fusion deserve a full analysis on their own for how isolated and endangered they make you feel. Obviously, the heartbeat and metallic footsteps of the SAX are iconic and incredible for how mortifying they are, but the music really solidifies the experience. Non-functional harmony and these very open chords keep the atmosphere feeling tense and disorienting. The first time you hear the soundtrack, you may not like it because it's designed to feel alien and uncomfortable. The more segmented structure of the game, which really feels like a design choice made to accommodate shorter play sessions on the GBA, has the danger of getting stale as you progress, going from one sector to the next, solving problems that, although catastrophic, you start to realize you'll be able to solve. But once you've visited every sector, this happens. On your way back to meet with Adam, the power dies and you have to start navigating on your own. First you stumble back to your ship to discover that the X have shut down the core, then you have to reignite the core yourself. And because the power is down, the save and health rooms no longer work. You have to use the tools you've scavenged thus far all on your own. The game spent hours drip feeding you new abilities and touring you around the station, and now you have to go it alone for the first time. If you manage to beat the mini-boss in the core and get it up and running again, you'll end up encountering the first SAX sequence you can't just wait out. You hear it before you see it, it's down there waiting for you, and you'll just have to run. For the rest of the game, as you start to push against your environment, you'll start to see Adam less and less. For me, this is one of the only games I've ever played where I feel exactly the same way the protagonist confesses to feel every step of the way. When Samus feels apprehensive about taking orders from an AI, I feel the same way because I don't want to be bossed around in my Metroid game. When Samus has a nameless fear, likely due to a newfound vulnerability to her environment, I feel that same fear, and all that intensity starts to build into this sequence. Late in the game, you'll have a rematch against this malfunctioning sentry robot that gives you a beam that can cut through walls, so you immediately hightail it over to a secret lab you found deep in Sector 6. Once you sneak inside, you discover that the Federation has been breeding Metroids on this station, hoping to harness their power as weapons or an energy source. When Samus feels shocked and betrayed at this moment, I do too, but you know what else we both feel? Like we were right. We were right to be suspicious of Adam, who had begun to grow more distant and concerned at our increasing recovery. We were right to feel uneasy about setting foot on this station, and we were right to wonder why the hell they built an exact replica of the planet's environment out in space. It's like video game animation study says. This game is a mystery, and the way you solve the mystery is by healing and recovering. That's what I love about Metroid Fusion. That's it exactly. The feeling you get where the things that you fundamentally need to do to survive and to get the job done lead you down the precise path you need to walk in order to have your questions answered. And that feeling you get when you begin to risk more in order to uncover the truth. Despite the incredibly linear story and progression, this is still a game about having to find new ways to progress. Despite the way the game deliberately limits and cuts off your choices, this is still a game about agency. But instead of being about using agency to explore the world in new and unique ways, this is a game about winning your agency back. There are still some very video gamey and action-y parts to this game that make it very fun and rewarding in a traditional action-adventure kind of way, like the fight against Neo Ridley or some of the power-ups like the speed booster and screw attack. You get one pretty hopeful and exciting music cue in the final mission, and then right before the final boss, the game finally opens up and allows you to hunt down all its items in one final collectathon victory lap. But the thing that keeps me coming back over and over and over again is that experiential gestalt, that simulation of proving your convictions and intuitions right as you manage to struggle to survive and overcome traumatic circumstances. I played this game for the second time during the pandemic, and that feeling of having to progress and heal and work as hard as you can to take care of yourself when you aren't presented with a lot of options really resonated with me. I think even more than it did during my first playthrough, and it solidly sets Metroid Fusion as one of the best game experiences I've ever had. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you want to learn more about the Metroid franchise as a whole, I strongly recommend you check out Transparency's video on the lore of the entire series. The folks at Transparency do an incredible job of breaking down the overarching narrative of the entire Metroid franchise, but I don't want to spoil too much, so if any of the overall Metroid story from this video piqued your interest, their video would be the next best thing to watch. And that's it from me for now. I really love this game, and if you're looking for a way to get into the Metroid series, I strongly recommend checking this one out. Anyway, I've got a couple other video ideas in the works, as well as some music coming down the line eventually, so stay tuned, and thanks for stopping by.